Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to this week's Community Archives discussion, collecting community materials. So here are our weekly topics for this week. Which factors might influence what materials a community archive collects? What are the benefits and negatives associated with collecting controversial materials? And how can collecting controversial materials support the goals of community archives? So we'll start by looking at our first weekly topic, which factors might influence what materials a community archive collects. And a big one that might influence this is something that we talked about fairly recently in this course, which is the idea of partnerships that a community archive might enter into, perhaps with a more traditional archive, an institutional archive, perhaps even with a museum or a library, perhaps with another nonprofit. But as we discussed, there are a whole variety of manifestations of partnerships that community archives can enter into, and it's important to think about how these partnerships might determine, at least in part, what kind of materials a community archive collects. So for instance, if a traditional archive is giving community archive advice, then they may suggest that community archives collect particular materials, whether because they're easy to preserve, whether they're thought of having more informational value than other types of records, whether it's because the mainstream archives feels that particular records document a community's history in a way that might be more meaningful than other records. So that is certainly one way in which a partnership with the mainstream archive might influence the decisions that community archives make about the materials that a community archive brings into their collections. Another example would be when we talked about stewardship and even custody of materials that a community archive has actually being kind of taken care of or even held by a mainstream archives. You know, mainstream archives may be reluctant to take care of or provide stewardship of certain materials if they feel like the materials don't really have a lot of value and they'll just be kind of taking up space and taking up resources. If they don't feel like materials are, worthy enough to be supported by the mainstream archive, then that might kind of trickle down into appraisal choices that a community archive makes. And this might be especially true if materials are controversial, which we'll talk in greater detail about later on. But, oftentimes traditional archives have more stakeholders that they need to sort of keep happy and appease, and that may lead to a certain reluctance on their half to provide stewardship or provide custody for community archive materials that might be challenging for whatever reason. So I think you could make the argument that the less mediated a community archives is, the more freedom it might have to collect materials that are thought of as being controversial or not traditionally thought of as being archival. And we've looked at some examples of both of these types of records throughout the semester. And again, we'll touch on controversial records a little bit more later on in this lecture. Another important factor to consider with community archives, and really all archives, is the idea of sustainability. So community archives should really think about the resources required to acquire, maintain, and provide access to records when they are making choices about which records to collect and bring into the community archives. And this is especially true because community archives, as we'll talk about later on in the semester, are oftentimes in a more precarious situation when it comes to access to the different types of archival infrastructure that archives need to be successful, whether that be staff, resources, just organizational culture, partnerships. These things can be more difficult for community archives to come by. And so they just have to be more careful about where they use the resources that they have. And obviously that is going to impact the amount and even types of records that a community archives can realistically expect to take care of. So if you're a community archive and you don't really have a lot of technical infrastructure, you don't have a lot of resources for server space, then collecting a bunch of digital records might not be the best choice, because it's going to be difficult to meet the needs that those digital records are going to require. So that's just kind of one example. Another big one is the wishes of the community. So some members of a community may wish to see a community archives collect or not collect particular materials. And there are a whole host of reasons why this might be true, and we'll touch on them in just a little bit. And ideally, a community archive represents the wishes of the community that it is associated with. And so you could make the argument that community archives have an ethical responsibility to provide an access to records that the community feels are meaningful, are important, are records that the community feels comfortable sharing, and not records that don't meet that criteria. And you can tie this to sustainability as well. So if a community member or community members that are wealthy or especially supportive of the community archives say, we really don't want these types of materials in our repository, then that may add extra weight to the decision of whether or not to acquire records that a community archive has to make. It's unfortunate, but pragmatically speaking, community archives, again, oftentimes have to kind of make tough pragmatic choices. And if getting the support that your community archive needs depends on you not acquiring collection material that a certain person or individuals find to be problematic for whatever reason, then sometimes you just have to bite the bullet and hope that what you're doing is for the greater good. And sort of related to the wishes of the community is just the overall mission of the archive. So what is the community archive trying to do? What is it trying to accomplish? What image does the community want the community archive to project? And ideally there is a strong overlap between the mission of an archive and the materials that it acquires, maintains, and provides access to. And an interesting example of that is the Kagan article that we read earlier on in the semester, where community members in that article were really interested in portraying a specific image of Jews in America, and they didn't want particular perspectives or particular characteristics of Judaism or Jewish culture or Jewish society or Jewish history to be substantially present in the community archive that they were creating. And so that led them to, acquire and make accessible certain materials and say, we're not really interested in acquiring these other materials that kind of paint a picture of Jews in America that we're not really interested in sharing with the public. And so obviously this choice about what to collect and what not to collect, and what to include in the community archive and not include in the community archive can be a huge source of tension and debate. You know, community archives exist because certain people feel or have felt a void in history and society and archives of records related to them and their identity. And if people see a chance in the form of a community archive to make sure that their identity is sort of expressed and maintained, that they do have their seat at the table, you know, if you say, well, you know, your perspective is fine, but it's not really a perspective that we want to share with the rest of the community or with the greater public, you know, that can cause a lot of hurt feelings. It can cause people to sort of feel marginalized again and left out. And, you know, it certainly is something that can cause a lot of discussion among community members. And that's something that the Kagan article represented pretty well also. So this discussion over what to include in community archives or what material should be collected by community archives ideally involves a lot of participation by community members. You know, this is a very essential part of sort of the creation and maintenance of a community archive, is which materials are in it and which materials are not. And we've discussed at pretty great length throughout this course that participation by community members is really what makes a community archive a community archive. And that makes it especially important when decisions are being made about what to include and what not to include in a community archive, that there is sort of a meaningful and deep and broad participation by community members to help make this determination. And that's something that the Kagan article talked about as well. It talked about there was sort of a meeting or a series of meetings among people who were affiliated with different aspects of Jewish life and Jewish society, and they all kind of came together and had discussions about what should be included in the archive. And some of them, at the end of the day, felt like, wow, you know, I don't even know why I came, because basically everything about my sort of corner of Jewish society was left out. But you know, at least there was this participatory aspect of that decision. And I think that you could argue that the more meaningful and deeper participation is, the risk of perspectives being left out of community archives is going to be reduced if, you know, different facets of a community do have a chance to say, you know, here's why I think records related to my experience within this community, within society as a whole, are important enough to be included, and they do have a seat at the table when that discussion is going on. That just allows for more conversation to take place. It allows for different people within a community to maybe see things from the perspective of others and feel less or feel more comfortable with having these perspectives present in community archives. And, you know, ideally that's going to result in fewer perspectives being excluded from community archives, which again exists because of exclusion that community members have endured in the past. And we've looked at a couple of articles that touch on different examples of what this participation might look like when this decision about what material should be included in a community archive is addressed. So the Rodriguez article and the Grimm and Ortega article from a couple of weeks ago had some good examples of, you know, having really good discussions with community members, having, you know, things like an advisory board, and really providing a forum and a format, having community workshops where people can sort of contribute their thoughts about what a community archive should look like. And, you know, really, again, that's that's the ethical thing to do. And it is something that can really make a community archive truly a community archive. And there's an obvious link between, as I've sort of touched on already, between which materials are collected in representation of belonging. Again, if a particular member of a community feels like their perspective or their sort of part of the community is being excluded from the community archive as this discussion about which material should be included and which material should not be included, then that really can detract from their sense of representational belonging. It can make them continue to feel sort of othered and marginalized and isolated, and can prevent them from feeling a connection to other members of the community even, and certainly society and the general public at large. And, you know, as we talked about in this class, community archives really exist to support this sense of representational belonging. So it seems like it would be unfortunate that the decisions that a community archive makes about which materials to collect would continue to make someone feel like they're being symbolically annihilated, and they don't have the sense of representational belonging that you know, you could argue is really important for everyone to feel. And again, you can make the connection between the community materials that are collected and this idea of postmodernism, because the materials that are collected can serve as counterforces to social meta narratives. And this can be true even within specific communities. So if there is a perspective within a community that is sort of broadly represented in a community archive, and that perspective starts to outweigh the perspectives of other members of a community. And remember, communities can be sort of very varied and very disparate. So, you know, there may be people within a community that may have only superficial sort of connections to each other. And so there can be all this room for differences of opinion, differences of experience. And it would be unfortunate if the decisions that a community archive makes about which materials to include in the archives supports the creation of meta narratives within a community about the community and that community's history. And so again, I feel like if you engage in representative participation when making these decisions, if you have support from a representative corner of your community, then ideally that can reduce the likelihood that these social meta narratives are going to develop, and that a certain aspect of the community will be the ones speaking for the community through the creation of community archives. So as I mentioned earlier, the controversial nature of materials related to a community might be one of the deciding factors that contributes to the discussion over which records will be included in a community archive. And so it's helpful to kind of take a look at which materials might be controversial and how collecting controversial materials can be supportive of the overall goals of community archives. So yeah, we'll start with which materials are controversial, why, and to whom. There could be materials that are controversial to people inside of the community. So certain community members might be offended or made uncomfortable by their perception of a community that certain materials might fuel and support, and they may feel that this perspective is possibly harmful to the community or doesn't represent the community as well. And that can certainly give them pause when saying, yes, I want these records in an institution that that is going to represent us as a community. And there may be records that are controversial to people outside of the community, but not in it. So a community member might be perfectly fine with a record or a set of records, but there may be people outside of the community that that sort of feel uncomfortable by these records. And as I talked about before, that can have some influence on whether or not community archives collect a particular set of records, especially if it leads to difficulties when it comes to the community archive establishing partnerships with other institutions, applying for grants, receiving support from politicians, and in other ways as well. And the Burial article talked a lot about how there was a lot of censorship of records related to the gay community in Canada because at least the people in charge of the Canadian government felt like graphic depictions of sexuality really ran counter to the standards that that the government of Canada wanted to uphold. And Burial points out how these depictions of gay male sexuality have been vilified and attacked by social conservatives and religious fundamentalists. Certainly not something that has only happened in Canada, but that's the example that the Burial article gives. And so the inclusion of materials like this in community archives, while the community members themselves may not see them as a big deal, may result in some friction and some difficulty for the community archive when it tries to get support from people that may feel challenged by records within a community archive. To go back to this idea of controversial materials that are controversial to people inside of the community, there may be a fear that controversial materials reinforce stereotypes about communities and community members, and that they may lead to symbolic annihilation of the community. We've talked a lot about how community archives are often meant to sort of right the incorrect perception or perspective of a community, and people may feel like certain records being in a community archive that represents the community, which reinforce stereotypes that people have about a community, might do more harm than good. And there just may be an overall reluctance among people within a community to engage with negative aspects of the past, present, and possible future. People may just want to look forward and not kind of dwell on a past, which may well include, marginalization, violence, trauma, and community members might just, not want to have that be the focus of them and their history and their community, but rather what the community is doing today, and so on and so forth. And so that can really lead people to think of some materials as being controversial and a questionable value when it comes to what records end up in a community archive. And this is something that the CIFOR article talks a little bit about as well, when the author talks about arrangements of archival records that have voices, images, websites, and snippets of hate in such close proximity to other affects and objects, and how this demonstrates both literally and symbolically the intimate place of hatred in queer lives, communities, and activism. So some community members are going to feel comfortable with this proximity. They're going to say, yes, it's a part of what our community has endured. It's certainly something that remains relevant today. It's something that our community is going to inevitably face in the future. So it's important to document this aspect of our community, and other community members may not feel that this proximity is helpful, and they may not feel that this proximity does a good job of representing the community and perhaps helping community members heal from difficulties that they've faced in the past. So again, it's just important to have some kind of forum or some kind of interaction, meetings with community members where you can really understand as a community archivist what types of records people feel are controversial, what makes them uncomfortable, why they feel reluctant to include certain records, and again, just allow people to kind of speak their piece and at least incorporate their thoughts and wishes into your decision making as much as possible. You're not going to please everyone, but it's certainly important to make the effort and again encourage deep and meaningful participation about which records end up in a community archive. And it's interesting to think about some of the benefits and negatives associated with collecting controversial materials. And this is something that the Hareda article talks a bit about when the University of Michigan was working on collecting records related to Theodore Kaczynski, the Unabomber. And, it resulted in some negative media coverage. It resulted in some privacy concerns. There was certainly some reluctance on the part of the University of Michigan to be associated with Ted Kaczynski and to have his records housed by an institution that was supported by the University of Michigan. And, again, partnerships can be a big factor when these choices about collecting controversial materials are made. And if the presence of controversial materials makes institutions uncomfortable with partnering with community archives or really any kind of archives, then that can certainly be a difficulty for archives down the road. And obviously media coverage can be a big one, and it's something that the Hareda article talks about a fair amount. Media coverage about controversial materials may make them seem more controversial to people inside and outside of the community. It can kind of fan the flames and make people uncomfortable with things that they may not have been aware of or may not have felt uncomfortable with before. And this can be true, again, of people inside and outside of the community. And again, it's important to consider that community members may be reluctant to support community archives that publicize community controversies or bring up painful memories. Again, there are people that just kind of want to move on and not dwell on the past or negative experiences that the community has. And if materials within the archives sort of bring them up, then that can be sort of triggering and traumatizing as well for community members who, again, may have been directed or impacted by these events directly, may have had family members who are impacted by events that the archive is seeking to document. And, it can be painful and it can be harmful. And so that's just something that archives need to be aware of when they are making decisions about collecting certain materials for the community archive. However, it's important to note that sometimes controversial materials may be the only records documenting communities available to researchers. So this is something that the Berry article mentions on page 230. Because records related to particular communities have for so long been excluded from archives, that controversial materials like the Beefcake magazines that this article focuses on might be the only preserved and accessible materials related to a community that researchers can really look at and interact with. And it may be the case that it's better to have something than to have nothing. And if you are a community member and the only sort of reflection of your past or of your connection to the community and society at large is represented through controversial materials, and those controversial materials are excluded from community archives because of their controversial nature, because they ruffle feathers within or outside of the community, then again, that can really undermine a person's sense of representational belonging and make them feel like they're sort of continually being excluded from the community and from society at large. Okay, and then we'll wrap things up by talking about how can collecting controversial materials support the goals of community archives. And I feel like you can connect this idea of collecting controversial materials with some of the core principles of a community-centric framework that we have talked about for most of this course. So the CIFOR article talks about the idea of collecting materials that express hatred towards the LGBTQ community. And the article also talks about how naming hatred and acknowledging it as an organizing principle of LGBTQ archives can really serve as a catalyst for building queer and critical archives and developing archival practices that reflect the experiences and desires and meet the needs of LGBTQ communities and individuals. So controversial materials can sort of light the flame and make community members feel like, okay, we really need an archive that represents our experience and serves as an actual reflection of our community and of our community's experiences. And so I think that you can connect that with our framework here, our principle here, an archive that represents the community complexity and flux. So just the fact that a community has experienced trauma and difficulty in the past, and maybe even continues to experience it today. And incorporating controversial materials can do a great job of demonstrating the complexity of a community and of a community's experiences. Related to that, the CIFOR article on page 768 talks about how documenting anti-LGBTQ materials can add nuance to experiences of community members and can demonstrate that hate isn't just limited to significant events, but is rather a daily part of queer lives. So the article talks about Matthew Shepard, and it really says, obviously that was a horrible tragedy, but if archives only collect materials related to these sort of broadly known and broadly covered traumas that the LGBTQ community experiences, then it kind of overshadows the sort of daily hatred and abuse that the LGBTQ community members may experience. And that can result in people not really knowing or understanding the experiences of people of this community. And that doesn't really result in an accurate depiction of that community and what that community faces. So again, it just adds a more complex picture of a particular community than just kind of focusing on big events and things that are already well known to the general public. The Barrett article notes on page 222 how controversial materials may reveal aspects of a community overlooked. So again, getting back to this idea of community complexity and flux, there's an interesting part where the author talks about the placement of bandanas and what that means and what that has meant for the LGBTQ community. And if you aren't collecting materials like these Beefcake magazines that really document that and provide examples of that into the future, then you kind of lose that that part of a community's history. The Barrett article also talks about how the absence of controversial materials may prevent a community from being represented a physical and discursive space. So, again, if controversial materials are all that it exists of a community because other records have been censored or aren't available, and a community archive says, well, we're not going to collect those records, that might not be a choice that really meets the interests, needs, and well-being of a community, because it essentially says this aspect of the community doesn't exist. People that are connected with this aspect of our community really don't belong in our community archive. And again, that can be a pretty painful thing for people to hear. The CIFO article notes on page 770 how controversial materials can give voices to those in communities that feel self-hatred and other internalized negative emotions. So just seeing within a community archive the experiences of others who might have experienced the same thing that you as a community member have, that can definitely be a very helpful and valuable thing. It can support the sense of representational belonging that we've talked a lot about. And so again, you could argue that while these controversial records like letters and other things expressing hatred towards LGBTQ community members can be harmful and they can be difficult to see, they may also serve a purpose of just making people feel less alone and less like what they have experienced is something that they're the only ones that have gone through whatever negative emotions and experiences they're feeling. And I think you can argue on the whole that just this process of determining which, if any, controversial materials are included in archives can ensure that community well-being is central. So just this process of participation and having conversations with other members of the community can increase the likelihood that the archive that develops is going to have the community's interests, needs, and well-being as a central focus. That is going to allow community members and community records to be understood and valued in their originating context. It is going to represent the flux in communities, the flux in complexity within communities. So again, controversial materials can really spur a lot of valuable and helpful discussions within a community about exactly what the community is, what the community archive should represent, and that can certainly be a valuable process. And it's also important to consider about how practices that community archives engage in, which may differ from more traditional archives, can be more capable of placing materials in proper context due to community knowledge and experiences. So it makes a lot of sense that a community is going to have a better understanding of controversial materials and how these controversial materials have impacted the community, how they should be documented within the archive, how they can be sort of sensitively handled and provided access to, and the knowledge of how to handle controversial materials may not exist at the same level in archives that aren't community-based. So if anyone is going to collect this stuff and make it available to the public and help it serve as sort of totems of identity that a community has, then the community members themselves are often the best people to make the decisions about what things like access and preservation and other aspects of archiving are going to look like. And again, that can really help a community portray itself actively and portray the records in their originating context, can represent the flux and complexity of a community, and can make sure that community interests, needs, and well-being are central within the community archive. Okay, so we'll go ahead and stop there. Appraisal, which essentially what we're talking about here, is obviously an extremely important process that every archive goes through. And sometimes that process includes making choices about whether to include or not include certain perspectives or certain controversial materials within an archive. And in some ways, community archives may be better positioned to acquire and provide access to controversial materials. They may have sort of less oversight, less people that they need to please, and that can give them the freedom to acquire and present materials that other archives might shy away from. And community archives ideally will benefit from the knowledge and experiences of community members when it comes to interpreting and providing access to these controversial materials. But again, at the same time, controversial materials can certainly make community members feel uncomfortable and sort of like they're reliving a potentially painful past. And again, it all just goes back to this idea of participation and making sure that a representative sort of sample of community members are able to contribute to what these appraisal decisions look like. It may just be that appraisal takes place in community archives like it does in a lot of traditional or mainstream archives, where there isn't really a lot of appraisal that goes on at all, and things just kind of are brought in and then you figure out exactly what you've agreed to collect. But I think ideally there is more of a deliberative process, more of a careful consideration about what is coming into the archive and how that might impact and how it might represent the community members that community archives ultimately exist to represent and support the identity of community members. So we will go ahead and stop there. As always, thank you for listening, and please let me know if you have any questions.